What are the origins of MAGA?
To all Americans tonight, in all of our cities and in all of our towns, I make this promise. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. God bless you and good night. I love you.
The idea of Make America Great Again as a slogan started with the successful presidential campaign of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Reagan's version started with the word "let's," and it appeared on bumper stickers, pins, posters, and even hats, though it looked nothing like the red bucket hat that Trump would come to popularize. As a political ideology, MAGA most closely resembles the isolationist America First movement of the 1930s and 40s, with its large swaths of Nazi sympathizers and fascists. As a movement created by Donald Trump, Make America Great Again began with a single infamous descent down the golden escalators at Trump Tower.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Trump trademarked the phrase "Make America Great Again" on November 7th, 2012, one day after Romney lost the 2012 election. At the start of the primaries that election season, Trump had polled at 40% with Republican voters, though he never officially threw his hat into the ring. Though MAGA would officially begin in 2015, its origins can be clearly traced back to the birther movement, which Trump also spearheaded during Barack Obama's tenure. The most popular strand of birtherism has to do with the theory that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. Rather, he was born in Kenya, making him ineligible for the presidency. Birtherism is our best shot at understanding the inception of MAGA because it tells us who Trump voters were before they became Trump voters. It was the political debut of Donald Trump, and because it allowed Trump to hone in his political persona for 2016. The connection between birtherism and MAGA puts on full display how much racial animosity and conspiracy theories lie at the heart of both. Trump engaged in the birther conspiracy at a time when his popularity was high with Republicans in order to test the waters in case Romney lost the election.
To put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing? What really happened in Roswell? And where are Biggie and Tupac?
This is the age of misinformation, get information. No homosexuals, Democrats, or immigrants in your nation. I gotta think about anything else. I try to cope, but it's bad for my health. I don't even think that anything helps. This is the most paranoid that I've felt. This is the age of misinformation, how could you be?
Let's begin our birther journey with a quote from a paper written by Ashley Hardina and Michael Traugott titled "The Genesis of the Birther Rumor." The propensity to believe in conspiracy theories and political rumors is a function of underlying predisposition and motivated reasoning. We show, like others, that rumor endorsement can also be a function of individuals' group attitudes. In particular, among white Americans, birther beliefs are uniquely associated with racial animus. We merge this finding with other work which shows that rumors are more strongly endorsed by the individuals most motivated and capable of integrating them among their pre-existing attitudes and beliefs. We find, therefore, that it is white Republicans who are both racially conservative and highly knowledgeable who possess the most skepticism about Obama's birthplace. Birtherism began in 2004, directly after Barack Obama's speech at that year's Democratic National Convention nominating John Kerry.
Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
Chronic fringe political candidate Andy Martin jump-started the birther movement by claiming Obama is a Muslim who has concealed his religion. Birtherism didn't actually begin with the claim that Obama was born in Kenya, but instead claimed that he was a Manchurian candidate for Islam. The movement really picked up steam when various emails between Hillary Clinton's staff during the 2008 Democratic primary were leaked. One of the emails read, Barack Obama's mother was living in Kenya with his Arab African father late in her pregnancy. She was not allowed to travel by plane then, so Barack Obama was born there and his mother then took him to Hawaii to register his birth. Clinton played no part in spreading rumors about Obama's birthplace. However, the damage had already been done. Donald Trump would cite the Clinton emails as proof of Birtherism's claims and then use them to deflect blame once the movement fizzled out. In the summer of 2008, Republican presidential nominee John McCain made a surprise announcement. He was picking Alaska Governor Sarah Palin to be his running mate for that November's election. To say that Palin had been an obscure figure in national politics before the announcement was to put it lightly. Even people whose job it was to report on politics had never heard the name Sarah Palin before. McCain and Palin were both seen as political outsiders and mavericks, but that obscured one major difference between the two. While John McCain had little patience for nativism and conspiracy theories, Sarah Palin's stock would be tied to both. Her populist demeanor, disdain for elites, and abrasive attacks on Democrats gave Palin her own enthusiastic base of support in the Republican Party. Palin rallies in 2008 were a separate ballgame altogether from McCain events.
A small town in the swing state of Ohio is where Sarah Palin addresses some of her core supporters. This area is mostly white and working class. And here's what some have to say about presidential candidate Barack Obama.
I'm afraid if he wins, the black will take over. It's not a Christian. This is a Christian nation. What is our country going to end up like?
When you've got a Negro running for president, you need a first stringer. He's definitely a second stringer.
He seems like a sheep or a wolf in sheep's clothing, to be honest with you. And I believe Palin, she's filled with the Holy Spirit, and I believe she's going to bring honesty and integrity to the White House.
He's related to a known terrorist.
In Barack Obama's book, A Promised Land, it's even mentioned that McCain apologizes to Obama personally for the attacks sustained by Sarah Palin. It's not difficult to imagine that the Palin crowd and the birther crowd had significant overlap. In fact, many view Sarah Palin as the proto-Trump or pre-Trump, the harbinger of what was to come. At first, Donald Trump approved of Obama's first term. Bizarrely, Obama's first collision with Trump world happened in 2010 during the Deepwater Horizon crisis. Trump called the White House shortly after BP's offshore drilling rig exploded, offering to head the response team. Obama's staff told Trump that it was already being taken care of. Switching subjects, Trump then offered to build the White House a giant ballroom to expand the East Wing, replacing the tents that were broken out whenever there was an event at the White House with overflow capacity. Trump's generosity didn't last long, however.
What? Show his birth certificate. I think he probably
have to?
Because I have to, and everybody else has to. I want him to show his birth certificate. There's something on that birth certificate that he doesn't like.
Oh my God.
By early 2011, Trump's tone changed completely, just as he started to do well in the 2012 Republican primary polls. Trump had just witnessed the hunger in the Republican Party for a Palin-style candidate equipped with an entire cachet of paranoid conspiracies. Trump was the first to get birtherism into the mainstream. The corporate news giants came to him. Instead of pushing back, the media treated Trump's claims as a spectacle. And Trump, as he does best, promoted the shit out of himself through it all, honing in a persona that would propel him to the White House 5 years later. Against his team's advice, Obama quickly produced his long-form birth certificate, hoping to put an end to birtherism and embarrass Trump in the process. It accomplished neither. Obama's long-form certificate marked the beginning of the end for mainstream birtherism, but the beliefs of Republican voters didn't actually change, and Trump merely wiped his hands clean and declared a victory. Here's a quote from Make America Hate Again, a paper by Stephanie Kelly Romano and Catherine L. Carew. For example, following the release of the long form, Trump reported being really honored, frankly, for playing such a big role in something that nobody else had been able to accomplish. He often remarked that he had people who were studying, researching, and reporting back to him. He claimed to be privy to information and evidence that validated his suspicions, but conveniently couldn't really talk about. On MSNBC's Morning Joe, he alluded to a tape that's going to be produced fairly soon and that somebody is coming out with a book in 2 weeks. Consistent with the conspiracy advocate and the paranoid spokesperson, Trump demonstrated that he had access to information and is part of the larger network working to expose the conspiracy, find the truth, and protect what is good. By the time Donald Trump declared his 2016 candidacy, he had defined his base of support, cast himself as a hero in their world, and sharpened a battle-tested persona that appealed directly to their paranoid leanings. In fact, without the birther movement, the conservatives that found Sarah Palin's message in 2008 most appealing might not have accepted Donald Trump as their guy. There are a few lessons we can learn about how birtherism led directly to the White House. National surveys conducted after 2008 showed that while 91% of Americans came across information that claimed Obama was a secret Muslim, only 55% of participants saw the opposite information. Likewise, while 60% of participants said they came across info claiming Obama was born in Kenya, only 30% of participants saw the opposite on that one. It suggests there is something we can do about misinformation. It just won't maximize ad revenue or click-through rates through spectacle. Another lesson was alluded to in our first quote of the episode. It was highly educated conservatives that believed most in birtherism, not the politically uneducated ones. This is because belief in conspiracy theories depends on your own predispositions, and the highly educated have a lot of them. High exposure to information leads to more opinions that people can use their own confirmation bias to legitimize. For example, what is the difference between a conspiracy theory saying that President George W. Bush, for example, wasn't an American citizen through some convoluted scheme, and birtherism? The birther movement seeks to legitimize a white nationalist point of view. Consider how Trump handled a comment by Whoopi Goldberg on The View. In a lively birther discussion on The View, Whoopi Goldberg remarked that no one has ever asked George Bush or said to George Bush. Trump, in a very telling way, talked over her and said, "I guarantee you, and I'm no fan of George Bush, but George Bush was born in this country." Obama is not afforded the same assumption of citizenship as any previous president because he is not white. Trump's tone of voice reinforced the certainty that Bush's American identity need not be questioned. Donald Trump was also never the bad guy during the birther movement. During his 2016 campaign, long after birtherism had fallen out of popularity, he tweeted the following: "Just remember, Hillary Clinton started the birther movement in 2008. She was all in." Lastly, Trump's moving of the goalposts during birtherism was telling. Here's another quote from the Make America Hate Again article. Later, he explicitly stated his suspicion when he posited that Obama was perhaps born in this country, but said he was born in Kenya. Because if you say you were born in Kenya, you got aid, and he got into colleges. Trump used multiple issues to extend the breadth of the conspiracy, each rooted in the otherness and undeservingness of Obama. In raising issues about ability and access, Trump drew on the major premise of the conspiracy, which was that Obama's otherness precluded him from being able to legitimately attain success. We can use Trump's own words to sum up what birtherism did for him. When asked if he thought he went overboard on the whole birther stuff, Trump responded, "I don't think I went overboard. Actually, I think it made me very popular if you want to know the truth, okay? So I do think I know what I'm doing." The following is an interview I had with Dr. Tyler Parry of UNLV. That's the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, which is also the college I went to. He's the author of books such as Jumping the Broom, The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual, which I found highly enjoyable and I would recommend. He was also awarded the American Folklore Society's Wayland D. Hand Prize for Best Book Containing Historical and Folkloric Methods. Dr. Parry and I sit down and talk about birtherism in more detail. Well, thank you, Dr. Parry, for sitting down with us.
Absolutely.
So here's the main question I have about birtherism and MAGA. What can we compare birtherism to historically? Are there any movements that have been like the birther movement?
Well, I mean, birtherism as the concept we understand it is really foundational to the formation of the American Republic as envisioned by, founding fathers, the majority of whom were slave owners, who largely viewed America's future, this is Jeffersonian specifically, as kind of a large-scale representation of white European yeoman farmers. And so one of the first things to consider about the position of non-white people within the American Republic is that Jefferson, up to Lincoln, a lot of politicians basically came to the conclusion that black and white coexistence was impossible due to the system of slavery and kind of this enmity that developed between the two groups. And so Jefferson had this proposal. He never acted on it, but he thought that the possibility would be, once people of African descent become free, that they needed to be repatriated somewhere else. That could be West Africa, maybe somewhere in the Caribbean, to some degree taking a cue from what was happening in Haiti in the 1790s. And Lincoln bought into this too. He envisioned that one way to prevent the Civil War was to convince people of African descent to leave the country, and that the U.S. would pay the way. And this is the Liberian Project. Right?
Monrovia, Liberia. Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so very few, percentage-wise, African Americans actually take up the U.S. government on that offer. And part of what changes Lincoln's mind eventually is Frederick Douglass just condemns the whole idea. So Frederick Douglass, being a formerly enslaved man who became a great orator in the abolitionist movement, basically says, no, we are as American as anybody else. Like, we have been here and toiled, our fathers toiled, our grandfathers toiled on this soil, we built it and we intend to stay. And so, I mean, the birther movement, as we understand this idea of, who is an American, how do you validate the American experience? This is a question that has been asked since the 1700s, at least.
Yeah. Well, I think that segues just right into the idea of, I think a lot of people, especially today, try to separate out conspiracy theorism and nativism. In your words, how are those kind of like intimately linked?
Yeah, I mean, nativism is a concept that has really driven this notion of what America looks like, and that has even included and excluded at different times people of European descent. So what always comes to mind for me with this idea of like nativist movements is Irish immigration in the 19th century and then the early 20th century, Italian immigration a little bit later than that. This notion that there's a certain fit or a certain ideal, a certain framework, a certain religion that only belongs within the United States. And so the nativist movement, you could say, was also embodied by the second generation of the Ku Klux Klan, to where they even eliminated the idea that Catholics and people of Jewish descent could even be part of what they deem to be truly American. So nativist movements have taken, very extreme racist formations embodied by the KKK, but also nativism could be something along the lines of maybe a Christian nationalist idea, to where there's a certain exclusion of other religious communities in favor of this idea that America was founded by Christian people upon Christian ideals, and that's the only way to remain purely American going forward.
Gotcha. So a lot of it has to do with this kind of definition of what it means to be American from people's eyes.
Right. And it can conveniently change based upon whatever political power is in operation, or whatever political ideology is going to operate the best at that time. Because the Irish will eventually become, quote unquote, white people at some point, right? It takes multiple generations of this investment in proving one's Americanism. But what scholars have noted is, how the Irish and the Italians become white is largely through deliberate expressions of anti-blackness. And so to prove your whiteness, you have to effectively other a different community. And in this case, kind of the scapegoat population was African Americans. And so to prove one's whiteness as an oppressed Irish person, you had to not view yourself as having anything in common with the person of African descent, despite the fact that you might be in the same socioeconomic position. And so the implementation of this idea is that you have to kind of divide people to acquire individual groups that could help you politically.
Okay. I actually have an additional question then that I've been personally wondering about.
Sure.
Do you think the process that you just mentioned, do you think that at this moment, the Hispanic population is being brought into that umbrella through MAGA and all those things?
I mean, I think yes. This is something that ethnic studies scholars have been curious about for a little while, because the unique aspect of what Trump has done is he acquired gradually a larger percentage of the what's called the Hispanic vote than Mitt Romney did or any of his predecessors in the Republican Party, despite the fact that he made some pretty horrible comments about the community as a whole, some generalizations that were very damaging. But he's able to utilize like this idea of citizenship and what it means to be American, how you become an American, as to weaponize that and to convince people who did it in kind of the documented, legalized way that they did not have anything in common with those who did it a different way, right? And so it's again this divide, so where even though you might have a similar cultural heritage, even maybe a similar national heritage, the way one becomes an American is only this way, and then that excludes the group that didn't do it the way you did.
Not to dwell on it any longer, but I see some obvious parallels between that and your book, Jumping the Broom. And just the idea of that, like the difference between sort of like a state sanctified marriage, and then, so I saw a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of legality and its intersections with culture is really kind of part of the framework for understanding what is legitimized versus what is illegitimized, despite the fact that a similar ritual might happen. And so, to reference the point about jumping the broom and marriage rituals, one of these large questions that happened after the Civil War is, what do you do with all the newly freed enslaved people? How do they become citizens after being states of slavery for multiple generations? And one of those questions was, well, there's a legality of marriage that's required within the citizenship of the United States. And so for enslaved people who got married under slavery, jumped over a broom, or maybe even performed like a traditional church wedding, those marriages were considered not valid under the eyes of the law, right? And so there was actually this conflict between formerly enslaved people, where they would basically tell the U.S. government that had come down to occupy the South during Reconstruction, they say, well, I got married, I don't need to do it again. And I don't need to pay for a marriage certificate either. That just seems ridiculous to me. And so it's kind of this interesting framework for understanding what that transition to citizenship looks like. And even the resentment of people who said, well, what you are then saying is that what I did wasn't good enough. And I don't feel the same way.
Gotcha. So some birther arguments, they not only include Obama, being born in Kenya, famously, but also he was raised in Islamist ideology when he grew up in Indonesia. First book written by his neighbor, Bill Ayers, using a fake name. So what do all these claims have in common, and why are birthers subject to believe these additional conspiracies, beyond being born in Kenya so easily?
Well, I think that the question of Obama's citizenship and his birth certificate really set the tone for understanding how easily opponents of Obama could be convinced that everything about him was fake, like everything about him was a lie. And it reminds me of this really kind of awkward moment that John McCain had on the campaign trail, where he's doing, crowd work, right? He's taking questions from the audience and he's approaching them with a microphone. There's kind of two that stood out, and they really came down to this idea that these individuals couldn't trust Obama because I think one woman said he was an Arab. Another person believed that he was not in alignment with like American values. And McCain, he becomes somewhat famous for the way he handled it. It was a bit more civil in that he rejected what they were saying. But it always kind of had bothered me that he had an opportunity, I think, to kind of correct the narrative, because the woman who claimed that Obama was Arab, his response was, well, no, he's a good man, he's a good father, and a good American. That's great to say, but he could have said he's not of Arab descent, but even if he was, that wouldn't matter, because he can still be as American as anybody else. So they were still playing into this idea of the audience to where for them, the image of American has a certain ideal, and then subconsciously even a certain look. And I think incidentally, whether intentionally or not, he kind of reinforces that idea by just saying, well, he's a good man, a good American. But he could have said, an American can be anybody. It doesn't matter what you look like or what your religious heritage is, that you can be an American, and that's valid in his eyes. So I think that when you look at that first presidential run, this idea that, Obama, you can invalidate his birth certificate amongst a certain segment of the population, just really lent itself to people believing anything else that came along that may have made him sound shadier as a candidate. And this really even starts in the primaries, right? So one thing that Trump will claim is that Hillary Clinton started the birther movement.
Yes.
There's no real evidence that she ever bought into it. It was a couple of aides attached to the campaign that were, I think, later let go pretty quickly afterwards. But one of the original hints at Obama's kind of quote unquote foreignness was, I think it was one of the aides to the Clinton campaign says that he lacks sufficient American roots to become popular with the broader American public. It doesn't really say he wasn't born here, or doesn't say anything about his birth certificate, but it was this conception that because of his upbringing in Indonesia, and even being born in Hawaii, made him very different than the conventional Americans who lived in the 48 linked states of the United States. So that kind of then catapults into this entire question as to where he was born. But then because of the Indonesian upbringing, this idea that Islam may have infiltrated his mentality, that is completely incompatible with American principles, supposedly founded upon Christian principles.
So then that's pretty good summary of this, but so how specifically has othering been used as a political tool in movements, things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question in that, othering as a concept is inherently political if you believe that most decisions on the world stage in many ways are political. So one way to, I think, frame the concept of othering is that it becomes a tactic to shore up support amongst a population that is desiring some form of institutional power. So as earlier referenced, I think that the Irish case is a classic example of this. This is a population where there were signs that said Irish need not apply. It was very deliberate that there was a foreignness attached to Irish people, despite the fact that they were Europeans, in the same way that the European continent views itself as having Europeans housed within it. But because of a certain religious difference, because there was a colonization process of Ireland based upon this notion of foreignness. They at one point spoke a different language, in Irish Gaelic. The political philosophy of utilizing this notion that one group is better than the other, despite the fact that they have much more in common, is really a part of the American political process in various phases of it. So you have to be able to convince a population they have more in common with a rich person, who lives a few blocks away, despite the fact they have very different socioeconomic statuses. And so racialization within the American context is usually the form of othering that most people focus on, because that has been used as a political tool to garner support. That everybody who is racialized as one group has something to gain from these broader policies that are being espoused. One way I think this works is through the immigration debate, that you convince usually working class individuals that jobs are going to be taken, or that the reason why they are unemployed or underemployed is because this person from somewhere else is taking their job, quote unquote. And so what that then does is it places people who have actually very similar economic circumstances with one another against each other, instead of actually blaming maybe the corporate owners who are actually the ones doing a lot of the problem, and actually hiring people and paying them below, the federally recognized minimum wage, right? So a lot of this intersects with this notion of power structure that also intersects with race, class, gender. Othering is just a broad category to describe the ways under which a dominant group subordinates another group and convinces that subordinate group that they are, basically worthless within the broader American polity.
Yeah. So here's definitely a double standard. When I saw Donald Trump on The View in 2011, they were asking him questions about George W. Bush's birth certificate, and he basically, throws it off and said, "Oh no, I know his birth certificate is legit." However, he was on The View, to talk about Obama's. Mm-hmm. One example that kind of came to mind was the idea of freedom papers. Can you tell me why that might or might not be a helpful way to understand that?
I actually think this is really important context because there's maybe two aspects to this that are important to consider. Mm-hmm. One is that in the 19th century, very few people had a birth certificate. Like a birth certificate, as we understand it, is a relatively modern concept, like this federally recognized document that is supposed to prove that you are born in a particular location at a particular time to particular people.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people who recorded births may have done so in like the family Bible or something along those lines. Yeah. And so what is kind of interesting about this question is this notion of having papers or having some type of documentation was strictly required of African Americans. Under the supposition that they might have been a runaway or something like this. You had to prove your free status, whereas a white person never did have to prove their free status, because also the way immigration policy worked in the 19th century, it was not at all like the process that we know today. Like many of the European immigrants who came through Ellis Island, we would now call undocumented in some ways, because the process was much easier to go through, because there was a specific pull of European immigrants into the United States. So what is kind of interesting about this entire aspect is the fact that one would not require George W. Bush to produce a birth certificate and Barack Obama, a man of African descent, to produce a birth certificate, is that actually reflects the way it's usually gone in American history. And particularly if you consider the 19th century prior to the Civil War, it was usually African Americans that had documentation to prove that they were free, or that they could be mobile around the society.
Yeah. That is a fascinating answer, I will truly say, especially the idea of people at Ellis Island being undocumented. And I didn't think the answer that you gave was going to be that one for one, but that is. I guess that that's par for the course.
Yeah, and it's not to say that they weren't like cataloging people's names, because you can see the registers of people coming off of the ship, but the process that people now have to go through, if you compared this experience now to what people coming through Ellis Island went through, I mean, a lot of people, if they transplanted that idea up to now, a lot of people would claim that there's some foul play going on. Like too many people are being let in.
Yeah.
So it's. I think the historical context is necessary to understand that this idea of having documentation at all times, in particularly the 19th century, was a pretty unusual concept. Like you had to be of certain means to be able to have that on your person all the time, or you had to have something to lose. So in the case of people of African descent, if you were free and you had documentation to prove it, you did have to have that with you. You had to have that particular document that proved your freedom. Or if you were enslaved in the U.S. South, you had to have a pass from the slave owner in order for you to go between plantations, because the patrols were targeting you as a black person. They weren't bothering like the poor white itinerant laborer who was walking around on the same road.
So why do you think Trump was able to so successfully go from, 2012 campaign is Birtherism, 2016 is MAGA? How did that transition happen so seamlessly?
Well, the cynical part of me says that people have short memories to some degree. Like some people might not remember like how invested he was in that moment. And I think for a lot of people, it's something they just brush aside, say that was just something he was doing. It was a phase, because he would later, I think, admit in 2016 at some point that he believed Obama was actually born in the United States, right? So but I guess to more concretely answer the question is that when Trump, who I believe maybe identified as a Democrat at the time, but when he was elevating himself to national prominence by undertaking this birtherism question, there was one point where he was second to Mitt Romney in the polls, right? So during that 2012 election, if Trump would have run, he was the second most popular candidate amongst Republican voters, despite the fact that he had never really affiliated as a Republican in any formal capacity prior to that. So I think that once he realized that he could gain attention, be it negative or positive, as long as it was publicity, that's what he wanted. Once he realized that people could latch on to something that seemed really outrageous, but if he kept pushing it, there was a certain segment of that base that was willing to just follow a man because they saw him as fearless against, the lying news media. Because even though he was probably friendly to CNN to some degree in like 2011, 2012, Republican voters largely saw CNN as the enemy. And so if you have Donald Trump going against all of these reporters and, not backing down, I think a certain segment really admired that about him. And so he was able to leverage that aspect of himself to then formulate the MAGA movement. And, obviously, if the MAGA movement is predicated upon this idea of immigration policy, I mean, who better than a person who's willing to question the citizenship of the most powerful man in the United States?
That is unfortunately very well said.
I take no joy in realizing this is the reality, but it's it all does weave together when you think about it.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree.
Yeah.
So this is a Vegas question, since we are both Vegas residents.
Yep.
Right now we're at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
So segregation in the Vegas Valley officially ends by the Moulin Rouge Agreement in 1960, but we also see the historic West Side of Las Vegas at the same time. It's cut off by railroad tracks. It's a place where Black business owners were forced to relocate to after the 1940s. Vegas has even been referred to as the Mississippi of the West. So how could a place like the historic West Side exist after the formal end of segregation? What can that tell us about, things we've discussed today? And I also hear that you have a new book coming out. If you also want to relate it to that, because I know they're related topics.
Sure. Yeah. So I will try to be brief here because this is an entire course that I teach on Black Las Vegas. But effectively, what we're talking about in reference to this interview is the way under which segregation operates is kind of a localized concept of otherness. And so as more African Americans move into the Las Vegas Valley, all of a sudden the mayor decrees that they can only live in one section of town. And it was deliberately the section of town that was away from downtown, the main economic center, west of the railroad tracks, which at that time, I think most people don't know, was a town site that was invested by a man named J.T. McWilliams, but he lost out on the water rights to the Las Vegas Valley. So his town site was basically dilapidated. There was, basically broken down shacks and, there were tents. There was not a lot of infrastructure. And so the mayor basically says all people of African descent have to live over there. So they can't live in downtown and they can't leave the area unless they're going to work, right? So due to this though, the West Side becomes a place that kind of develops its own kind of subculture within the Las Vegas Valley. Despite the circumstances of being marginalized, there's community developments. Churches are built, casinos are built. At least at one point, a resort was built. And a lot of the people there largely see that as a space where they could be their authentic selves. And so it's this classic story as to how a marginalized group of people finds dignity in the face of oppression by creating something on their own. And so even after formal desegregation in 1960 through the Moulin Rouge Agreement, there still is kind of this attachment to place. There's this attachment to one's childhood, the memories that people share in community with each other. But also, the thing to understand is that economic segregation as attached to racialization is still very much a reality after 1960, because a lot of people have difficulty moving out of the historic West Side. There's maybe like a rising middle class that's able to leave. But even in 1969, 1970s, the majority of Black people are still living in the West Side, despite the fact that they can live elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so there's a variety of different reasons as to how segregation operates, one of which is even after it's formally done away with, it remains due to kind of an economic marginalization, as well as an enforcement usually by police. And so my book that I'm currently writing, hoping to finish by this summer, it is under contract with the press, so I'm hoping to get it done soon. The story that I'm telling is kind of looking at policing more broadly throughout the Las Vegas Valley, but at least half of the chapters spend a significant amount of time within the historic West Side, because that was a zone, because of segregation, that was highly policed. But highly policed largely as a way to contain the population. So who are the ones that enforce the law or even the traditions of society? It's usually law enforcement officers. And so if a Black person is caught outside the boundaries of the West Side, say in 1956, there's a suspicion that they're committing a crime or they're trying to go somewhere where they're not allowed to go, because you couldn't go into a casino outside of the West Side as a Black person in Las Vegas in the 50s.
Yeah.
And so it would be the police force that was largely commissioned to enforce these policies. And that will even occur afterwards. So when you have this uprising in 1969 in the West Side neighborhood, it is the police that respond, and one thing they do is they block off all the exits and entry points into the actual area.
Okay.
Right? So, I mean, this whole component of designating one section of town as only housing or being able to house this group of people basically remains in operation, and one can say even until, recent history as well.
Yeah.
But also because of that, and again, talking about this idea of community formation and a sense of pride, despite the fact that you are a marginalized community, is that the historic West Side is now designated as kind of a historic space within the city, right?
Yes.
You see the signs when you drive on Martin Luther King Boulevard. When you pass the freeways on the 95, you've entered the historic West Side. And I think that is a way to ensure that people never forget, like to remind the city, number one, of what it did to people of African descent, but also that the people that live there did create something that they can feel proud of.
Yeah. And then we have to go with the last question here that I ask every single person.
Yeah.
What is one conspiracy theory that you believe in?
Gosh, I mean, I'm not even sure if it's a conspiracy anymore, but it seems pretty clear that UFOs are here somehow. I mean, and maybe this is my Southern Nevadan talking, but I've always been fascinated by Area 51.
it is a Southern Nevada fascination, for sure, absolutely.
And I think that I guess actually recently Trump said he's going to release files on UFOs. But I mean, I have trouble believing that we're alone in the universe. Now, whether that means it's a technologically advanced species that's hovering over and watching us, I wouldn't put that out of the question. Even with the way that historic forms of colonization have happened, like the quote unquote more dominant, more technologically advanced society tends to scope things out before they actually do anything. So I do kind of wonder if aliens, maybe if they're not here, they're close.
Yes.
So I'll admit, I am fascinated by the UFO question.
I give you a 10 out of 10 for relating it back at the end. But that was stellar, 10 out of 10.
Thanks.
But thank you very much, Dr. Parry, for sitting down with us. I think this has been an absolutely illuminating interview. And just thank you for spending time with us today.
Thanks, Michael. I was happy to do it.